There aren't too many things you can talk shit about the UFC about.
I'm going to talk shit about it. That clip comes from a GQ video. Dana White replies to fans on the internet. And the question was,
why do you think people seem to talk about UFC fighter pay? Phew, I would also like to get paid more at my job, lol.
If you didn't know, fighter pay is a topic of great contention in the UFC, with everyone. The fighters, the reporters, the talking heads on YouTube, the typing heads on Twitter and Reddit, Instagram comments, boxers, the Gadigal tribe, and the Noongar Whadjuk tribe. All of them think UFC fighters should earn more. Everyone except Dana Pink.
People thought I was pink before? Yeah, look at me now.
Obviously, it's not just evil Dana. It's likely a decision corroborated with other UFC executives, but Mr. Pink is the spokesperson for the company, so it's kind of a Trinity-type deal.
I smoke marijuana so I don't beat my wife and children.
You clearly didn't smoke enough, mate. Let's review how UFC fighters currently get paid. UFC fighters are contractors, or at least they're supposed to be. They sign a contract with the UFC with two main qualities: the length of the contract, measured in number of fights, and the show win money for each of those fights. Individual contracts may differ, and the show win money may be contracted to change slightly based on performance, but that is broadly how all of them work. The number of fights is going to be some whole number, normally between 3 and 8, and the show and win money are going to be equal to each other. That's right, when you see a fighter lose, you also watch them lose half of their paycheck. Individual fighters with a lot of leverage or good managers have negotiated a larger show and smaller win, or an even larger show with no win bonus, but the way the fighters and commentators talk about it, it seems nearly everyone has equal show and win amounts, especially the less prominent fighters. This is completely different to boxing, where both boxers are paid their predetermined sums after the fight is over, win or lose. Dana says this is so fighters eat what they kill, i.e., fighters have a greater incentive to win and therefore put on more exciting fights. Which sounds logical at first, but Dana has oversimplified a very complex system as an excuse to pay fighters less. UFC 298 was one of the few modern events where the Athletic Commission still releases salaries. Let's take a look. Wow, would you look at that? Topuria is on a flat show rate and he still managed to knock Volk out. From what Dana tells me, Topuria should be fighting in a very boring manner. Robert Whittaker put on a great fight and survived this spinning kick, even though only a quarter of his paycheck was on the line. Alright, now I'm confused. Fighters, even one who already held the belt and probably has a fat savings account, somehow put on a great fight without most of his pay being dangled in front of him. Maybe large win bonuses wouldn't be an issue if the show money was sufficient, but it's not. The fabled 10 and 10 is a running joke, because that is the contract most fighters are initially signed to. $10,000 to show, and $10,000 to win. This is just ridiculous because that is not enough to support a so-called professional athlete. Fighting is a big deal. I wouldn't fight more than 4 times a year. Most fighters fight 2 or 3 times a year. This brain damage thing is no joke.
He's reaching for those grapes. He's trying to make his wine, and the wine's already sounding like a violin with that cheese and wine.
And giving your head less than 3 months to rest after being knocked around is a recipe for a very short career and consequent vegetative state. Not like fighting once a year will regrow neurons, but 2 or 3 times a year seems to be the maximum most fighters can sustain and still be able to spell their name when they retire around 40. These fighters are no spring chickens either. In 2017, the average ages of the top 15 in each weight division can be seen here. Most of these guys have families they need to support. Let's say you just get signed to the UFC and fight twice and win both fights. If you win both fights, the UFC will graciously award you with $40,000 for the year. That is before the tax man takes his cut, before you have to pay your coaches, and maybe you have to pay a manager. This is just not conducive to supporting what is the next generation of fighters. Most men signed to the UFC work a day job and train in the evenings, which is just not right as the premier combat sport organization on earth. This is because your athletes are obviously not going to perform as well if they have to take time and effort away from their training. If you ask Dana why he doesn't pay fighters more, he will say, because we can't afford it.
Mind your business.
Yeah, right, buddy. In 2022, the UFC turned $380 million in profit. There are currently 2,951 athletes signed to the UFC, with the least fortunate on the glorious 10 and 10. Let's vastly overestimate what it would take for UFC fighters to not struggle. Let's say the least fortunate fighters fight once a year and lose. They earn $10K. If the UFC paid every single one of its fighters an extra $40K as a salary, it would cost them an extra $118 million in salaries, which seems like a lot, but they can afford this. They turned $387 million of profit in 2022. They also boasted record revenue last year, but no profit number was released. There were some fighters suing the UFC for predatory and monopolistic practices. From this lawsuit, the public got a lot of information about fighter pay. The UFC spends about 20% of its revenue on athlete pay. For reference, the NBA splits revenue 50-50 between the league and the players. For the NFL, it's 48%, same with the MLB. The UFC is shafting its athletes like mad. They are able to do this in part because if you want to make a living as an MMA fighter, the UFC is your only bet. Well, it's your best bet. All the other promotions do pay their very top guys reasonable sums, but excluding the champion of each weight division, everyone else gets paid near zero. Now you might say, well actually, Dana is kind of right here, the UFC isn't so bad. Yeah buddy, they make more than all the other promotions combined, and I just told you as a percentage it's also awful. Even worse is that the UFC uses its monopoly to lock fighters into these unreasonably long contracts and not budge an inch when fighters want to leave. Francis Ngannou sat out of competing for an entire 12 months, near the end of his career when his popularity is at its peak, because he and the UFC couldn't come to an agreement. Francis wanted more money.
That's fucking illegal.
Dana didn't want to give it to him, to which a great hashtag was spawned. Francis had to wait out his contract because the UFC would not release him early, knowing full well he was not going to fight in the UFC again. They held him for an entire year just to be petty. Francis eventually made the money he was demanding, probably even more in boxing, so the tomato took the L big time here. The biggest loser out of all is Conor McGregor. Believe it or not, the most financially successful got played more than any of them. How is this possible? Well, the antitrust lawsuit forced the company to release some payslips. Conor's biggest confirmed UFC payday was $6.8 million against Eddie Alvarez. That card did 1.3 million pay-per-view buys. In his single boxing match, he took home a reported $130 million from that Mayweather fight, which did 4.6 million buys. I'm no mathematician, but you can see the disparity in those numbers. The UFC was and is robbing Conor blind. He's only so rich because of his whiskey company. You know Conor isn't getting what he's worth when Jake Paul was giving him pity when these numbers came out. The least intelligent thing about the tomato refusing to pay up is the obvious good the expense would do the UFC. For UFC 300, the 3 performance bonuses were upped from 50 to 300k, and it showed. Those fights were absolutely nuts, except for Aljo's performance.
Yeah, you better win your fight because I'm coming on your ass, boy. I'm coming for that ass. Pause.
Publicity is the name of the game, and the more exciting the fights are, the more people will want to watch them. Dana can do this by not just offering 3 bonuses per card for Fight of the Night and 2 performance bonuses. But what if every finish, a finish being a knockout or a submission, was awarded a bonus, and increase these bonuses to something worth fighting over? Let's say 100k. I think there would be an immediate increase in the number of finishes in the UFC, because currently there is nothing to contractually incentivize a knockout over an awfully boring decision win.
I'm gonna leave you frozen like Elsa.
One does this, and they very intriguingly have more finishes in their fights. I think the fighters at one must just be better or something. Now, Conor has probably made more from his UFC career. It is known Dana gives locker room bonuses, but your income as a fighter should be derived from the fighting, not the sloppy toppy you dish out backstage. So once again, the UFC is using its position as the only organization worth fighting for to horrifically underpay its fighters. Even all the way up to Conor McGregor, who practically built the UFC into what it is now, all by himself, and who the company owes at least a few billion of their valuation to, and is doing so to its own detriment. The tomato is otherwise a successful businessman, but he flopped it on this particular issue. The only way I see this improving is if more fighters, specifically big draws and champions who can't be replaced easily, refuse to fight before demands are met. But no one seems to like unions. However, I don't see a way this is going to improve without a union or something very similar to a union.
And to be frank, he should just pay these guys more because Dana is just dogging the boys.
Just a side note, Dana says boxing is ruined due to the boxers not being hungry, as they are paid what they are worth. But Fury vs Usyk just happened, and that was a banger from the fight being announced to the final bell. Slava Ukraini. And Happy New Year!